Welcome to another painting tutorial. This we're going to look at Eyes of the Nine for Warhammer Underworlds. Obviously these guys are just regular to each guys, and so we're going to walk through all the different characters here. So starting off with the flame guys. So I put a layer of contrast medium on them first just to help blending here, and I'm going on with the yellow sort of at the bottom levels here. I'm just trying to do a quick and dirty painting of these ones. So doing sort of an orange in the mid area, and then I'm going to do a red near the top, and then after all this is done I'll do some black. So just trying to lay on the contrast paints to start with, and then go and blend them a little bit with a wet brush. Overall, like how this worked. Probably could have done one extra layer of white at the very bottom once I was all done. Now working on the blue horror and brimstone horror, that's what those guys are called. Working on the blue horror here, just laying on a base coat. I was pretty happy with how this one turned out, so I actually don't do anything further on the blue for him. Doing all the flesh on these guys, and just using the regular flesh on there, and again, pretty happy with how it turns out. Don't need to do too much more. There's enough texture on the flesh tone, or flesh with the muscles, bulging, whatever, to get you the result that's going with. Just as a note, with the contrast paints, I do lay on the base colors here, and then go back and do some extra highlights with them when I'm done. So some of the colors I leave just plain contrast. Other ones I go back and do other things. So Space Wolf's gray here for the this beast. I'm drawing blanks on all the names. Another note with the contrast, where these models join together, you can really notice the join lines if you just do the contrast as it is. Doing some purple fade on the feet here. Doing this sort of turquoisey color on the seer guy on his basic skin. Now some of the contrast paints, the colors that you see on the bottle, it's really hard to kind of determine what it'll look like when it's all done. So I'm actually contemplating putting together sort of a key with samples of each of the actual colors, because there's not a really good guide that I could find, which ones come out really opaque and which ones don't. I know there's some videos out there, but I need something that I can do a quick reference to. So I'm thinking of putting together some sort of a physical thing with the actual paints. I've seen different ways of doing that with bases and all that, but I don't really want to go out and buy a whole bunch of stuff. Doing the blending on the feathers here, so basically doing each layer of feathers a different color, all the way down to a red at the bottom. And doing this while it's wet, so I get a bit of a blend as they transition into each other. If I had thought about this more, I might have done some different colors, but I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Some turquoise here on the armor. Now this one here could have been maybe a bit different color for Zeech, but I liked how this went. This is one of the colors that I do go back and highlight with the layer paints. And doing some white on all these cloth bits. And again, that's another color that I do highlight up with some layer paints as well. Just wasn't quite happy with the amount of contrast. Okay, so these bases were done with this gray, but I actually go back and I think I do go back and do this with layer paints. I don't like how this looks on the bases, but I do the grays on some of the like the handle on his staff there. Okay, Abaddon Black for the Brimstone Horror's flame tips. And again, you could spend a lot of time doing these guys more and more, but pretty happy with how this turned out. Pretty simple way to do it. For this guy's horns, doing some skeleton horde at the base of it, and I'm going to transition it to the darker colors as I go up. Sort of mid area here, dark oath flesh, and then the very tips, I'm going to do Cygor brown. That's a pretty dark, very dark color, and then I'm going to try to blend it just a little touch. And this is a pretty good way of doing that, adding a little bit of contrast medium on my brush and blending it. It's sort of a wet blend, like super wet blend. Okay, now I decided to do these guys actual metallics, so using Retributor armor on all the gold, so going in trying to paint that as accurately as possible. As you can see, I did do the contrast paint on the silver, but I changed my mind and I go over that with a bit of silver later. Snakebite leather contrast for any of the strapping on these guys. I think that's a good color to have in your arsenal if you're not going all in with the contrast. Just lets you do lots of leather bits pretty quick. Okay, so on the bases here, so I've done these with just regular layer paints, and I did the Aggaros dunes sort of as a non-metallic gold on some of those pieces. There you go, lead belcher on the swords. There's only 3 swords, I think. Aggaros Earthshade on all the gold. So what I'm mostly trying to do here is just get a dark outline on this, kind of lining it, and any of the shading that it does, I'm going to try to touch that up a bit later. Sybarite Green, going over all these big flat areas. As we know, contrast paints don't cover flat areas very well. They're really good with textured stuff, not so good with big flat surfaces. So just trying to even out the coloring there with these layer paints, and doing sort of a traditional layering process, or at least the way that I've always done layering. Just treating the contrast as my base and shade, and then going up with the layers after that. And a little bit of edge highlighting here with Gauss Blaster Green, just to bring up the finest highlights on that. Okay, now highlighting up the white with a bit of a really light gray here, just trying to pick up some of those edges. You may or may not need to do this highlight. You could probably just get away with doing a pure white highlight on that layer paint. Sorry, on that contrast paint. And Necron Compound dry brush on these swords. So when I did the lead belcher over top of the contrast paint, I actually put it on thin, so some of the shading that the contrast paint gave kind of shone through. And so I didn't actually shade it again with Nuln Oil like I normally would. Anyway, so here's the guys all finished. Pretty happy with how they turned out. The one thing that's noticeable is these easy fit models often have joins in sort of inopportune places, right there in the side of his head. So you probably, if you want to have these guys look better, you got to fill that in before you use contrast paints. The other thing I noticed with contrast paints is if you're not careful while handling the model, they do have a tendency to sort of rub off on high edges and stuff. So you got to be careful. Maybe a paint handle is a good idea for that. Otherwise, pretty happy with this sort of hybrid approach of painting. In these guys, there's lots of different types of models. You have the horrors and the Cygors and the other guys, this sort of skin tones. So lots of variety in this warband to test out different things. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this tutorial or this painting video, whatever you want to call it. Check back later for other stuff. Leave me comments if there's things you want to see, and other questions if you might have them. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.